to the Vue.js.org new documentation page. Inside components in depth, in the props section, this seems to be quite an extensive section, but of course, props are something very common, very important in Vue. Props declaration. Vue components require explicit props declaration so that Vue knows what external props passed to the component should be treated as fall-through attributes, which will be discussed in the next section. In single file components using script setup, props can be declared using the define props macro, which we don't need to import because it's in the context of the script setup by default. So we run this function. As we've seen before, we pass in a list of props, and this returns the props so we can access them inside the script, like so, if we want to. In non-script setup components, props are declared using the props option, like so. This is how it was done in Vue 2. And then we have the setup function, where if we want to access the props, we need to pass in the props as argument, and then we can access them. And props is a reactive object. Notice the argument passed to define props is the same as the value provided to the props options. This is the same as this. The same props options API is shared between the two declaration styles. In addition to declaring props using an array of strings, we can also use the object syntax. And this is gonna be familiar to you if you have been using Vue 2, but it's instead of an array, you pass an object with a list of keys and values, where the key is the name of the prop and the value is the type of the prop. So this is for the define props in the script setup context, and this is in the non-script setup context in the props key. It's very basically this thing and this thing are the same. So again, the value passed to this is the same as the argument for the define props function. For each property in the component declaration syntax, for each property in the object declaration syntax, the key is the name of the prop, while the value should be the constructor function of the expected type. This not only documents your component, but will also warn other developers using your component in the browser console if they pass the wrong type. We will discuss more details about prop validation further down this page. If you are using TypeScript with script setup, it's also possible to declare props using pure type annotations. So we can use TypeScript like this, lang equals ts, and then, well, first of all, disclaimer, I don't know a lot about TypeScript, but what it's telling you is you can define props, you can add the type annotation for this function, and the type annotation is an object which kind of looks like this thing. The question mark means this is optional, and the string means, well, you know, the TypeScript type indicator. Prop passing details. Prop passing details. Prop name casing. We declare long prop names using Camel case because this avoids having to use quotes when using them as property keys, and allows us to reference them directly in template expression because they are valid JavaScript identifiers. So basically we use this Pascal case instead of kebab case with hyphens. Technically, you can also use Camel case when passing props to a child component, except in DOM templates. However, the convention is using kebab case in all cases to align with HTML attributes. So we have this prop, and then we can pass it in as this. Personally, I'm not a fan of that because, for example, if we have a single file component, we have a prop name like this, and then we look for this in all the project. We'll find all the instances of this, but not this. So if we look for this key in all the project, we won't find this thing, although we may want to because it's connected. It's not a huge problem, but it annoys me a little bit. There are workarounds with that, so maybe using regular expressions in the search. But you know, all these are annoying things that you have to do. So it's nice to have the option to use camel case props in the component, although it recommends not to use that. Use kebab case. We use Pascal case for component tags when possible because it improves template readability by differentiating view components from native elements. However, there isn't as much practical benefits for using camel case when passing props, so we choose to follow each language's conventions. So they choose these conventions basically. Pascal case for component names, kebab case for props. Static versus dynamic props. So far, you've seen props passed as static values, like in this thing. You've also seen props assigned dynamically with Vbind or colon shortcut, such as in here or here. Okay, passing different values types. In the two examples above, we happen to pass string values, but any type of value can be passed as prop, like a number or a number like this, stored in a variable. Boolean. 42, the meaning of life. Booleans can be passed like this. So if is published is true, it's the same as is published equals true. So we don't need to explicitly tell it it's true. Even though false is static, we need Vbind to tell Vue that this is a JavaScript expression rather than a string. Yeah, so it's telling us if we do, let's go to the playground. Then maybe we copy this thing. Like that. Forget that this is an input and this attribute doesn't make sense. What this is trying to say is that if we don't make this dynamic, even though this value is just a static value, like it's just false period, if we pass it in like that, this false, it won't be interpreted as a Boolean. It will be interpreted as a string. If we want to explicitly let false be interpreted as a Boolean, we need to make it dynamic. That's what it's trying to say. And also, if we make this like that, without giving it any value, it will automatically, it's like setting, this is the same as this, all right? Just passing in the prop name without any value is the same as giving it a true value, a dynamic true value. Then we can pass an arrays. Even though the array is static, we need Vbind to tell Vue that this is an array. This is our JavaScript expression rather than a string. Again, if we don't make it dynamic with a colon, this will be just interpreted as a string, not an array. Dynamically assign strings, arrays, objects, pretty much the same. Again, what I said about this, the colon here works also for objects. Binding multiple properties using an object. If you want to pass all the properties of an object as props, you can use vbind without an argument. Vbind, instead of prop name. For example, given a post object, the following template, Vbind post, where post has as an object with ID and title, is going to be equivalent to passing in the individual props, ID from post ID and title from post title. This, given that post has ID and title, is the same as this. And this is very cool. It's a bit less explicit, but it's more flexible. One-way data flow. All props form a one-way down binding between the child component and the parent one. When the parent property updates, it will flow down to the child, but not the other way around. So not up from the child to the parent. This prevents child components from accidentally mutating the parent state, which can make our app's data flow harder to understand. In addition, every time the parent component is updated, all props in the child component will be refreshed with the latest value. This means you should not attempt to mutate a prop inside the child component. If you do, Vue will warn you in the console. Like so. Here we are trying to mutate a prop, and Vue is going to warn us about that. So if we go and do component, which has a script setup, define props, and this can be a title, for example, and then we are going to try to mutate the title. Look at the console. Hello. We need to import the component, of course. Import comp from comp, and then we can use it. And then we can pass in a title prop, hello, like so. Importing the component, we pass it a prop like that. This takes a prop, trying to change the prop. There you go. Set operation on key title failed. Target is read-only. So props are read-only, only, and they trigger a warning if we attempt to mutate them, like this one. There are usually two cases where it's tempting to mutate a prop. The prop is used to pass in an initial value. The child component wants to use it as a local data property afterwards. In this case, it's best to define a local data property that uses the prop as its initial value. Easy as this. We define another property which takes the initial value as from the prop. The prop is passed in as a raw value that needs to be transformed. In this case, it's best to define a computed property using the prop's value. Like so. So these two things are very important and very good because it's a very common find while coding with Vue. So let's take a look at these two cases again. Don't mutate props, first of all. And then you have two cases where you might be tempted to mutate props. If you're using a prop as the initial value for some reactive property that later you want to change. For example, you have an input which is bound to a data in your component, and you want to give this input an initial value which is passed from the parent. You may be tempted to use the prop directly as the V model for the input, but then you shouldn't do that because that means that you're going to try to mutate the prop. So you should instead use this pattern. Get the props and then assign to a new ref the prop as initial value. Don't try to use the prop directly. And the second case where you might be tempted to mutate props is if you need to make some change to the prop and then use it. In this case, you should use a computed property. Alright, so mutating object or array props. When objects and arrays are passed as props, while the child component cannot mutate the prop binding, it will be able to mutate the object or array's nested properties. This is because in JavaScript, objects and arrays are passed by reference, and it is unreasonably expensive for Vue to prevent such mutations. The main drawback of such mutations is that it allows the child components to affect parent state in a way that isn't obvious to the parent component, potentially making it more difficult to reason about the data flow in the future. As a best practice, you should avoid such mutations unless the parent and child are tightly coupled by design. In most cases, the child should emit an event to let the parent perform the mutation. That's also very important. I'm working now in a Vue component that has like 3 or 4 levels of nested children inside. The parent component has a reactive object which contains the inputs of an entire form and performs hopefully some validation. But the actual inputs where the user interacts with the values are inside the children, and now the whole thing is a mess because I think I'm entering into these kind of errors. The prop is directly being mutated inside one of the children. It's an object with it's an object with nested objects, and the whole thing needs to be refactored. And I need to use this emit event pattern for that. So that's a common pitfall and something to be very careful about. This part, this one-way data flow is something very important. It's worth spending time on that because you're gonna find it a million times while you code with Vue. And if you understand this well, it's gonna save you time. And it's gonna save you lots of what the fuck mornings where you spend the whole day trying to figure out what the hell is happening with your data changing mysteriously and magically. So, worth rereading. Prop validation. Components can specify requirements for their props, such as the types you've already seen. If a requirement is not met, Vue will warn you in the browser's JavaScript console. This is especially useful when developing a component that is intended to be used by others. To specify prop validations, you can provide an object with validation requirements to the define props macro instead of an array of strings. For example, all this mouthful over here. Let's go through that step by step carefully. So first of all, we have the define props function here. We pass in an object as an argument instead of a string. String is like kind of the abridged or short notation for passing props, but here we are passing in an object. This object has a bunch of keys: prop A, prop B, prop C, prop D, prop E, and so on. And then we start with a basic example of prop A having a number constructor as a value. This means that this prop should be a number. We need to pass a number for this prop. If we don't pass a number, the whole thing is going to complain and warn us in the console. Here we pass in, instead of a single constructor function, an array, which means that this prop b can be either a string or a number. Here we pass in an object with a type string, which means this prop c needs to be a string, and required true means we need to always pass this prop. We cannot omit it. We cannot not pass anything for this prop to this component. It's required. Then we have the same, an object with a type, number, and a default. And the default is, if we don't pass this prop to the component, then it's going to have a default value of 100. Then we have an object with a default value. We have a prop e with a type object, and then the default is, instead of just a value, it's a function which returns an object. So that's basically the same. That means if we don't pass anything for prop e, the default value is going to be this. Then we have prop f, which is an object with a validator function. The validator function takes a value, which is going to be the value of the prop that we pass in. And then this validator function returns true or false. If it returns true, it means that the value we passed in is accepted. If it returns false, it means that it's not accepted. So it's not the right value. In this case, look, it's returning this, which means it's an array of the success warning tanger. If this array includes the value, then it's good. It's all right. That's the right value. If it doesn't, it's not good. And this means that the prop f needs to have a string value of either success, warning, or danger. It cannot be just some random string. It must be either of these three. And then we can pass a function as a prop, and the default, and the default, if we don't pass this function, returns default function, which is a string. Unlike object or array default, this is not a factory function. This is a function to serve as a default value. I see. So in this case, for example, if the type is object, the default function returns the default value of the object if we don't pass it in. In this case, if the type is a function, the default function is actually the function that will be used if we don't pass this function. So this whole thing is going to be used as default. All right. Code inside the defined props argument cannot access other variables declared in script setup because the entire expression is moved to an outer function scope when compiled. Okay, so if we go to our, let's start a new playground. What it's telling us here is that if we have default props, if we have this, like here, for example, we can't do something like this. This is not allowed. We cannot reference inside default props something defined, for example, a ref inside the script setup. That's what it's telling us. Because this thing inside is not in the same context as all this. It's telling us here the entire expression is moved to an outer function scope. So we can't. Additional details. All props are optional by default, unless required true, is specified. An absent optional prop will have undefined value. If a default value is specified, it will be used if the resolved prop value is undefined. This includes both when the prop is absent or an explicit undefined value is passed. When prop validation fails, Vue will produce a console warning if using the development build. If using type-based prop declarations, Vue will try its best to compile the type annotations into equivalent runtime prop declarations. For example, define props MSG string will be compiled into MSG type string required true. Runtime type checks. The type can be one of the following native constructors: string, number, boolean, array, object, date, function, symbol. In addition, type can also be a custom class or constructor function, and the assertion will be made with an instance of check. For example, given the following class person with a constructor with first name, last name, you could use it as a props type. Define props author person. Okay. I've never ever used this. I don't think I'll ever use this, but I mean, it's good. It's good because sometimes, no, that's actually very good. The reason is to avoid bloating the component with props definitions. We could have probably this in a separate file and use it here inside the component, importing it. And the second reason why it's useful is because maybe we have lots of components that use the same thing as a prop. Imagine we have 10 components that take author as a prop. So that's a nice way to abstract the object definition of the prop if we need to use it many times. If we need to use it many times, we should define it only once, not in every component that needs it. So that's very nice. There are other ways to do this. We don't need to use this class person thing, but it's nice to have. To validate that the value of the author prop was created with new person. This, okay. Boolean casting. Props with Boolean type has special casting rules to mimic the behavior of native Boolean attributes. Given a my component with the following declaration, define props has a prop disabled, which is a Boolean, the component can be used like this. Yeah, so if a prop is Boolean, then just passing it in the value of the prop, not the value, but the key of the prop, the name of the prop, without any value, will be the same as assigning a true value to that. And if we don't include it, it's the same as assigning it a value of false. When a prop is declared to allow multiple types, disable Boolean or number, the casting rules for Boolean will apply regardless of type, appearance, order. Alright, so if a prop can be Boolean among other types, this still applies. And it doesn't matter if we put number before or after. Alright, that's it for props. Next, we'll have events, but that's for the next video.